Absolutely.
So, hey, folks, I am David Beckmeyer of Outrage Overload, and I'm here with Cameron Cohen of the Cameron Journal. Hey, Cameron.
Hi. Hello.
And we're going to talk about, well, we're going to talk about a few things, but I wanted to get some, I've gotten a lot of feedback on this gender gap slash young men turning right episode that I did, which is good to get feedback because at least somebody's listening and paying attention and cares enough to say something. And most of it's good feedback. I mean, you always get some YouTube. I'm always getting YouTube hate. Like, okay, but
Yes.
mostly it's pretty good feedback, and even the bad feedback in some ways are not bad feedback, but like room for improvement stuff is actually kind of good because a lot of people wanted the episode to be longer. Like they wanted to drill down on more of these certain little threads we could pull on. So that's good. I mean, if
Yeah.
always leave people wanting more, right? That's a good thing.
Yeah. That is the business we call show.
Yeah. So one outcome of that is I think I am going to do another episode about the manosphere because that's something that I have obliquely sort of touched on in a few episodes in the past. Like we did an episode on radicalization, online radicalization. We did an episode on. I did the episode on sort of the crunchy to radical pipeline where we obliquely kind of talk about the manosphere because it kind of plays a role in that. And then of course I mentioned it kind of in the end of my monologue in the end of this episode of this young men turning right episode. And I guess two things I got that I have to say about that. One is it'd be fair to say I'm probably using that term in a broader sense than it may really exist in sort of academic circles. And also, I think a lot of people don't even know what I'm talking about. So I sort of make an assumption that people kind of have an idea of what I mean by that. But I found out, nope, some people have never even heard the term and have no idea what I'm talking about.
I have been covering the Manosphere basically since Gamergate. One of my first big get interviews was with Paul Elam, which is in CameronJournal.com under interviews. I need to download that file and re-release it on other platforms because it was done before I had the distribution I have now. So
Hmm.
there's a couple things on there I need to go grab and distribute better. But yeah, I mean, I was very much dialed into the MGTOW, A Voice for Men, Gamergate, Manosphere stuff because I used to write for the Good Men Project. And I contributed there, probably several dozen pieces. It was kind of my first big writing thing and where I got really a lot of exposure for stuff. Um, and yeah, I mean, this has been a conversation that, you know, kind of starts with millennials in their 20s, and then as the decade kind of goes on, and especially elder Gen Z comes of age, we start picking up older Gen Z with that as well. And now there's a lot of the stuff that started out in that, what at the time was a rather fringe movement is now extremely mainstream, and people don't realize that a lot of the conversation that we have around men, manhood, masculinity, all this type of thing started in the manosphere, gamergate spaces, online digital spaces where disenfranchised young men, which like I said began starting with millennials. To give you a reference, I was 26 in 2014. um and then later Gen Z. For millennials, it was kind of a new thing, whereas like if you found it and you were in the know sort of thing, or sometimes found it because they got divorced and turned to online spaces for other divorced guys because their life kind of blew up and all this sort of thing. And a lot of what I found, a lot of older and certainly younger Gen Z dudes, they were sucked right into all of that. They were middle school, high school when a lot of that stuff really started popping up. And so they just they never even had a chance to not get sucked into it. They really got shunted right into it, especially with some of the um woke cultural changes and shifts that were happening in the 2010s. Um and I think for a lot of young dudes who felt very left out of society, very disaffected, didn't know what to do, felt like their sexuality was being demonized, the being male was being demonized. They were looking for someone, something, somewhere. And lo and behold, there was a whole online community and world ready to talk about it, address it, deal with it, and validate a lot of the things that they were feeling. I think probably one of the biggest mistakes of the Democratic Party, which I'm going to use as a proxy for liberal left leaning people, between 2008 and well, quite frankly, today, is the left, liberal, all those groups. We do not address this. You will be hard pressed to find someone on the left who's written about men, manhood, and masculinity as extensively as I have. Um, and we have basically ceded that ground to the right. Um, and given that we're doing this live on the 22nd of September, 2025, we all know what has happened in the last 10 days, don't we? Um, and part of the reason why things are the way they are now and today is because the left became the party of women. I would say the Democratic Party is the first political party, arguably in world history, that is specifically woman forward. Men were specifically and intentionally de emphasized and decentered. And this is the language of the left. This is how they talk. This is how we talk about it on the left. De emphasized, decentered in favor of centering women, minority groups, immigrants, LGBT, all this sort of thing. And that has left straight white men, and some would even argue straight men of other colors, I say as a brown person, um, has left a lot of them, and I would say even us to some degree, I count myself a little bit part of this, um, out in the cold. And oh, Jurga's commenting. Tell that to Margaret Thatcher. I'm not saying that the Conservative Party certainly knew how to elect a woman in the UK, but they did not decenter men entirely. The Democratic Party has done something very different. It doesn't. It's not just putting out women candidates, which it's done since the '70s. Hi, Shirley Chisholm, first black woman to run for president, or even Geraldine Ferraro, first woman to earn a nomination for a major party for vice president. Um, uh, but the Democratic Party, especially after 2008, specifically decentered men as a major part of how the party did business, from how leadership was chosen, how nominations were chosen, how the party operated, what the party messaging was. Very different than just putting up a woman to be prime minister of the United Kingdom. Anyway, thank you, Ross, for commenting. We've seen it all this conversation, all this stuff about all these grievances, these problems. The left does not even engage in it and tends to blame men for complaining too loudly um when these things do come up. And the Republican Party, especially under Donald Trump's leadership, has swept in and has been there for young men in a way that the left simply has not, by intention.
Well, we that's one thing I do talk about a fair bit in the episode.
You do.
And I wanted to, and again, as you pointed out, I don't want to make all of our conversation today about this, but we do have to sort of acknowledge that it was, and to me, one of the biggest pieces of it is, so we on the day this episode dropped, coincidentally, like I didn't do the episode after the event, on the
Right.
same day that this episode dropped, we had the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Um, and arguably sort of an avatar of this whole movement, right? So you could
Yes.
say, um, and and I have not done my sort of obligatory statement on it. I feel like a lot has been said. I'm not sure there's much I could really add to a lot of that. So I have not done that. I did put a little pre-roll on that episode, just to kind of acknowledging it, and obviously, doing the. It's not a bold statement to say we don't endorse political violence, right? It's not particularly bold statement, but we definitely
Yeah.
don't. Like we want to make sure we make that clear. But the other aspect of that is that on one of the recordings, what you hear in the episode is we talk about the Minnesota shooting of the state senator, her husband, and the dog, um, because it had just happened. So here you
Yes.
have on one of the interviews, we had that political violence happening. And on the day the episode drops, we have this other political violence happening. And I think that speaks as much to like just the situation we're in as taking a political side on some of this.
Yeah, my statement on Charlie Kirk, which if you're that interested, it's fairly short. It was in the newsletter 2 weeks ago. I can read it out for you. Um, I what I really called upon, and the comment I got back most on it was calling for people's humanity.
Right.
And to remember about political violence. I am not a fan of political violence in any circumstances whatsoever. It is simply uncivilized. If we claim to live in a civilized society, political violence cannot be any part of it. I don't care who you are, what your political background is. Political violence is not the answer to the solution. We have a system in place to stop that. Otherwise, we might as well all start picking up guns, become warlords, and start shooting each other. Um, if you want to join my warlord crew, applications are now open. No, not really, but that would be the situation that we're in. So I want to avoid that. I'm not interested in, a warlord with, all this sort of thing. I want to live in a nice civilized society where I don't have to put up fence walls to defend myself. But so we can't have political violence. We don't know a ton about Tyler Robinson as of yet, which is funny because the narrative has already been set. Um, and there was already, I've literally seen people on social media calling Democrats the party of terrorism. I've heard calls for people to that all liberals need to be deported and the Democratic Party needs to be outlawed. Um, if you're wondering when the fascism starts, there it is, by the way. But also I find it I find it very intriguing that in this situation, we are desperately trying to fit him into a left right Republican Democrat political divide when, according to Trump's own Justice Department, there's absolutely no proof that Tyler Robinson had any connection to left groups at all. That came out this weekend. I mentioned it on the newsletter on Saturday. And what's even better is that um, we all people also don't really understand the online community he came from. And I saw a great video that said part of the reason why this situation is so confusing is it was not politically motivated, it was a shit post. There is, and this gets into what's happened to young men online, which is the topic of this. There is a certain amount of political nihilism present
And some of
on
it is like justified.
yes, yes. There is a certain amount of political nihilism that exists within I see it most in people younger than me. Sometimes I'm 37 years old. Sometimes you'll find it in people my age, but I tend to see it in my younger colleagues, especially in their late 20s, early 30s. They're 5 to 10 years younger than me. There's a political nihilism there that is like, look, none of this stuff matters. None of this is important. So let's just make fun of it. Let's poke fun at it. And I think and this kind of even ties into what happened with Pizzagate and all this sort of thing, is people get radicalized with these ideas. They think that, they're doing some great crusade or some wonderful important thing because they've earned an online community that verifies that echo chamber. And then they go out and do something really terrible, like shoot up a pizza joint, or shoot Charlie Kirk, or shoot the Democratic legislators, or any number of other political things that have happened in the last 8 months. This is, and I think there's no counterbalance to it. It's hard to off ramp about it, and I think one of the great problems of today is that the world has changed, and men are not adjusting to those changes very well at all. and and that we can have a conversation about social, and I do in America's Lost Generation, my new book that's out. I talk about the changes in the dating market, the changes. There's a huge economic conversation to be had there, but there's also changes in the dating market that have changed. There's social changes that have changed. Expectations have changed, and I think there's two groups. There's a lot of young men that are trying to figure out, well, what am I supposed to do? And the standards seem ever changing. And then there's another group of young men who know what the changing standards are and they're not interested in participating in it. Um, and to some degree, I don't blame them. And I think the worst part is, and I think what is going to bite us in the butt electorally for a long time now, is there has been almost no effort made by the Democratic Party, any mainstream leftist, to combat any of this for 15 years. Again, we ceded the whole discussion to Lex Friedman, Charlie Kirk, names. Online influencer, insert online right influencer names here. Um, and the left offers young men nothing other than a lot of sit down, shut up, quit whining, you know, go to therapy, get emotional maturity, all this type of thing. And I mean, let's face it, David, most guys want a nice girl who's at least they're physically attracted to and who's nice to them, sort of thing. And women now, they have jobs, they have careers, they have their own money, and their standards for what they want in a relationship are much higher than they used to be. And men, for better or for worse, cannot keep up with all of that. And so it has broken the dating market. It has broken, I mean, we're having less sex than we have had in recorded history, all this sort of thing. It is completely fractured something that is incredibly fundamental, which is a man seeking out a woman for companionship, partnership, and family formation. Scott Galloway talks about this quite elegantly. He's one of the few liberal people who even talks. It's like me and Scott Galloway are the only people talking about this sometimes.
Well,
And so
I'm reminded of the little quote from David Hogg, which is kind of controversial and probably still
yeah,
controversial on Bill Maher. You probably saw it about I'm kind of paraphrasing, but it's something like young men want to be able to provide or support themselves and get laid, right? And
yeah.
there's some truth to that, right?
Absolutely. I mean, when I was in my 20s, that was definitely something that kept me very busy and not laying around very much. And let's face it, this is where the economic kind of conversation comes in. Um, as women have gotten educated and done so well in today's service economy, economically speaking, we have left men behind. That was what I thought was so brilliant about Biden's industrial policy and why I was sad that Build Back Better didn't really ever go through is that would have provided millions of jobs in primarily male dominated industries. It would have gotten men back on an economic ladder and honestly made them much more economically attractive to women. And I can say that sort of thing matters. As someone who spent most of my life doing this and working as a full-time artist and political commentator, let me just put it this way, the money's not great. And so it definitely affects your ability to, be able to afford to go on a date or even, afford the price of speaking to a woman in public. It matters a great deal. And so if you're a working class young man with your high school diploma, you've watched your earning power crater this century. And if you're 22, like Tyler Robinson was, that man was born in 2003. He's never known a decent economy. He was 5 when the great financial crisis happened, and he was in high school when the pandemic happened, sort of thing. He's never known a decent economy a day in his life. And so that I think creates a lot of anxiety as well. And many times women are walking away with the better high paying jobs. And there's a lot of resentment, and there's a lot of online spaces that will cater to those emotions for young men.
Yeah, and something else you were talking about young men are trying to figure out how this works is they've also been channeled into this or boxed into these kind of sometimes conflicting like demands, right? You need to be sensitive, but you also
Yes.
need to be sort of manly, and you also need to be a breadwinner, but you also need to be, and it's like it can be really hard when y- we don't really have single family incomes anymore, really. And so all those things
More, yeah.
can be a lot of pressure, on a young man to kind of figure out. And then when you sort of get rejected, or it looks like it feels like you're being blamed for different things when you had nothing to do with it. Again, that pushes you back to that side. So regarding the episode, I know I had some feedback along the lines of most people get this wrong, and you did an okay job bringing a few of these things you usually usually don't see, sort of underrepresented out there. So, what do you think? Some things we sort of got right in this episode that are that are often underrepresented, and then we can start going into things where I could have gone down in more detail.
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, I was just happy to see the conversation at all. Um,
I got a lot of
I
feedback along those lines too.
Yeah, I mean, it was just happy that like, oh my goodness, for me, it was like someone not me is talking about this. Thank God. Um, and and so that was good. I do feel like the economic conversation was was talked about, but I don't think some people understood that's really the beginning and end of this conversation. The economy has changed in the last 25 years. We've really leaned into being a high-end services economy. And as I have long said, very crassly, this is the crass version, we forgot to make jobs for stupid people. Um, And we've done a fantastic job at creating jobs for smart, really educated people in lots of very high-end industries. We forgot to make jobs for people who put bumpers on Fords. And now there's a machine at Ford that does that. I mean, that's kind of part of the problem. There's not six guys in the paint shop. There's one man that pushes a button and the machine paints the car. I mean, the economy has changed where a lot of the jobs that would have supported a middle class family and lifestyle from many years ago don't exist. They just don't exist. And there's a lot of, I mean, and I've suffered from this as well. The advice I got when I was a young person was invalid. You know, I don't, and given how the economy is changing to I feel sorry for parents of teenagers right now. How could you help your kid pick a college major right now? We have no clue what the economy will look like by the end of this decade. Um,
And I
and,
think that's been true for a
so
while, and we're just now kind of it's really hitting home.
yes, and so I felt like that was something that maybe was discussed, but could have been more so. Um, I think sometimes, and I think this also kind of, sort of came across as there's a lot of people who commentate on this on our side of the aisle who kind of look at it as they kind of almost other it, like, oh yes, the man problem. Kind of like in the 50s when men would be kind of like, oh yes, the women and the women's vote and and they were very dismissive of it. Now it's kind of roles reversed, where a lot of times we're not, I think maybe sometimes a couple of the people talking about it didn't really take it as seriously or with the gravity of the situation in this moment, and understanding that when you have a society with a large amount of unemployed young men who see no economic prospects for themselves and see no way to get a wife and have children, that's a great way to get a revolution going quickly. Really good. History shows if you want a revolution, get yourself some unemployed young men who can't get laid, and oh boy, you'll have a revolution. Um, and and I think to some degree we've avoided that thanks to pornography and video games. I saw a tweet years ago that said, "Shout out to pornography and video games for helping us stop this revolution." And I think I, it's a crass comment, but it's true. I think a lot of the radicalization was, you started to go after the video games, you started to go after the stuff that had kept young men quiet, and now they're not so quiet because the left was complaining about, oh, video games aren't diverse enough, all this type of thing. All this little cultural messaging stuff, especially because it filters through to people, and this is something that wasn't really ever discussed at all, except kind of tangentially. That stuff really, I think, has an outsized impact on the psychology of young people and young men, especially, that the left was definitely not thinking about in the 2010s. And I think a lot of the reason we are where we are today and why things are such the way they are now is because no one ever took this seriously, but we kept messaging, through action, deed, and rhetoric that, young men, you're a problem. And I think probably the one thing that I was maybe a little bit disappointed was how out there and othered the conversation was, not understanding, I think, the real nature of the problem. But there were also many excellent points brought up about social media algorithms and radicalization in online spaces and echo chambers and, and social supports and loneliness and the breakdown of the social fabric that prevented this from happening in the past. All very important points.
Sorry, I actually hit the wrong button. Yeah, so we talked a little bit about
Yeah.
I tried to bring in some of the cultural things, and I did try to, point that get to that both from multiple perspectives because we had Eric Kaufman sort of coming from the, anti-woke side.
Right,
And
right, right.
and it can be sometimes hard to maybe bring enough of that out. But one thing we kind of tried to talk about a little bit is this idea that men are sort of both victim and perpetrator, and a lot of times on the left, the focus is on sort of the perpetrator side, right?
Yeah.
And not enough on the victim side.
No, and I was definitely glad to say. I mean, obviously, you got a lovely diverse amount of perspectives, and we there was a lovely sort of grand I think, really purview of the issue. Um, and I mean, you covered a lot of ground in 34 minutes and change,
Yeah.
which is really great. Um, and at first I was a little bit nervous about the length, and then I'm kind of like, actually, no, this is good. Like sometimes I love to do a long form thing. I think sometimes we're very tempted to do some big hour and a half sort of thing. Attention spans are short. You did a good job of covering a lot of ground in all in 34 minutes sort of thing. Um and I enjoyed your interstitials in between between the interviews. I think that is very important, and that's where I think the Democratic Party shot itself in the foot a little bit. Is there was a lot of focus on on the perpetrator angle, not much focus on the victim angle, and it really started to become, and this is why I say the party is decentered men, it really turned the Democratic Party into the party of women. And if you look at Gen Z voting patterns and how they poll, it's so obvious. Gen Z women are voting blue in droves. Gen Z men are not. Kamala Harris one Gen Z by a very slim margin that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. She only got 54%. It was higher for women. It was 63. But for men, it was only 51. So it was a majority. She did win Gen Z men, but it was not. It was a lot closer than it was for millennials. It was closer for her with Gen Z men than it was for Obama for millennials in 2008, which was the first presidential for a lot of millennials, including me. And I mean, I would have alarm bell if I were the DNC. I'd have alarm bells going, because the reality is you're going to have those voters for 40, 50 years. And if that's the future where we have a lot of women, but not many, all this type of thing, it's going to be very hard to win elections. And I'm not just talking the White House. It's going to be hard to pick up Senate seats. You're going to start losing House districts. Good luck winning a state legislature ever again in certain parts of the country. I would be ringing alarm bells. And I think to some degree, you've really got to turn the narrative around because a lot of the narrative has soured on this subject a great deal. And unfortunately, I mean, Biden tried to focus on material conditions to fix this, but I don't think I think the economic story is part of it, but I think also it's a matter of narrative. The Democratic Party needs to show that it is also for men. And unfortunately, I think that means dumping a lot of the cultural issue stuff that the Democratic Party has wedded itself too much that is out of step with where a lot of America is. Um, and I say that, as a triple minority who will definitely feel a sense of loss because it was really awesome to have a major political party talking about issues that mattered to me for once, sort of thing. But I also realized that time has passed. And if you want to get back Gen Z men, particularly white Gen Z men, the whole narrative has to shift quite quickly.
Well, and
And
I think
you have to start addressing these issues head on.
Yeah, I think one thing that I mean, there's a lot. Even though I sort of put a little disclaimer, and maybe I shouldn't have on Kaufman because his views are sort of outside most of academia, right? Even though he is an academic, but I just kind of. But anyway, I think one thing that I could really relate to was this idea of sacredness, right? How the left has created these sort of sacred ideas that, and then we talked about this, I think, other times about this idea of there's sort of no no forgiveness, right? If you violate one of these sacred, you step on one of these sacred you're never let back in. You're ostracized forever, kind of thing. And
Yeah.
I think that's a big factor for men too, because it's easy to step on this stuff. If you're a young man and you're into cars and motorcycles and stuff like that, and like where do you go? A lot of these spaces don't have opportunity for that, and there's nothing wrong with somebody's into cars and motorcycles.
Yeah, and but the problem is you'll have, someone come along and be kind of like, oh my God, but don't you care about the environment and all this type of thing? And for a lot of average dudes who are not chronically online as we are, who are not paying attention to every news narrative as we do, all this type of thing, I mean, let's face it, most dudes buy a motorcycle because it looks sexy and they're trying to get laid. Like, let's be plain language about this. So it's kind of like he's not concerned about his carbon footprint. He's very much concerned with whether he can get you out of your clothes tonight. That's why the motorcycle's here. Like, let's not you know. Um, and that's honestly why I told someone, I said, in a couple years, once I get through this startup with funding and everything, I'm going full boomer midlife crisis. I'm buying a Mustang. I currently drive a Subaru Forester, so it's going to be a big change. Yeah, um, but yes, I mean, there's a lot, but then that's the messaging narrative problem is a lot of young men in their 20s and 30s feel like they're the problem just for being young men who are into normal young men sort of things, and this has now become a problem for a certain section of the country who has some sort of issue, and also the online narrative is broken as well. When you have get posts like men will do anything but go to therapy, or they'll do this but not go to therapy, all this type of thing. The message to young impressionable men is quite clear. You're wrong.
You're
You're
broken.
broken. Thank you. Yes, you took the next word right out of my mouth. You're broken. And to make yourself worthy of our attention, you have to go away and fix yourself. And it is no wonder that a lot of dudes, even dudes my age, are kind of like, yeah, sex is great, but the juice is not worth the squeeze, literally. You know. And having been a year out from a 5-year very toxic relationship, I'm currently in not worth the squeeze camp. I get it. I'm just getting to a place where I'm maybe sort of flirting with the idea of maybe putting myself out there. And I get this about once a month, and then I'm like, no, I'm busy. I have other things to do. But yeah, I mean, and so I think there's that whole idea of, guys checking out, or just being afraid of a cold approach, or all these sort of weird dating things is just part and parcel of all that messaging. But then you get the cognitive dissonance of a clever New Yorker article where a woman saying, yeah, I was meeting with 5 vegans in Manhattan, and the women were sitting around complaining, we wish men, pardon my language, would be man enough to just fuck us. And it's kind of like, okay, you can't have it both ways. Do you want us to knock you across the head with the club and take you back to our cave? Or do you want us polite, heal them in therapy? Please pick one. Like, please pick a message and stick to it. We either need a club or a therapist, but you can't have both. Sort of thing. Like, you can't have it all ways. And I think, like, the reality is, I think, if you got a woman in an honest moment, it would be, yeah, she does kind of want her cake and eat it too. Like, she wants that duality of, yes, I want to be hit over the head with the club and taken back to your cave, but in a nice, sexy way, and in an emotionally mature way, sort of thing. Um, and I would
And we
say,
still care about our carbon footprint.
yes, and please drive a Prius while you do so. Take me back to your cave in a Tesla that's electric. Um, yes, like, I mean, and I think that the reality is, you can't. That's not gonna work. You can't have it both ways. You've got to pick. You can't have a narrative. Well, I will say this, because I honestly could fill that role, but I think the narrative, you have to pick a narrative, and kind
Well,
of
and
and kind of stick to it.
we're exaggerating, but
Of
there's like
course, yes,
there's
yes,
a
yes,
grain of truth to this. Like this is a
yes.
sentiment that's out there.
Well, but even so, I mean, like I said, in the New Yorker, the overheard conversation is the vegans being like, "I wish they'd just be man enough to, and that's the language they use, just have sex with us," sort of thing. And it's kind of like, okay, what you're looking for and what the dominant cultural narrative is cognitive dissonance. Like, that's not gonna work. You have to pick a narrative, sort of thing. And if you want to have a culture and society where men are cold approaching and all this type of thing, you cannot at the same time demonize men for wanting to have sex with women.
Well,
But that's what we've done, and
right. That's
it's
what we've
a
done. This sort of
disaster. Yes.
impossible. Yeah, we create this impossible ideal that doesn't exist.
And I think, for those of us who are a little bit older and all this type of thing, I think it's a little bit easier. For me, as someone single in my late 30s, it's a little bit easier for me to navigate this stuff because I'm older, a little bit wiser. I know for a fact there's no way in hell I would have been able to navigate this stuff when I was 19. I was raised religious, super sheltered. I went to a public college and women paid attention to me. And I was just kind of like, yes, all of you come, like, yes, like, come back to my room so we can continue with that coming work. I love that vibe. Come this way. Um, I wouldn't have been able to navigate all of that. Like, it's like you're 19, you're hormonal, like, sort of like. And I think a lot of guys are checking out because the risk is too high. Juice ain't worth the squeeze, and that is really a net negative for society because you lose economic growth, you lose new ideas, new innovation, you lose labor force participation. There's all sorts of downsides. Having a society where men are active, engaged, and doing great things makes for a wonderful and dynamic society. And it also makes for men who make enough money that women can deign to date them. And so I think in a weird way, we've kind of shot ourselves in the foot. And it's coming back to bite us in all sorts of odd cultural ways, and people don't see the direct results from it. And I think there was one woman on there who kind of alluded to that sort of thing. But I think the narrative has to shift in a more positive direction. And I think that's kind of what I was missing was that narrative piece of there's been a lot of narratives about men put out in the recent years. And if we want to start repairing if the left wants to repair its relationship with men in general in this country, but particularly Gen Z men, we need a massive narrative shift quickly. Um,
And
and
it's
I
not.
don't see it
I don't see it
happening.
coming from like a Schumer or somebody either, right? Or
Oh God, no. Chuck Schumer has no clue about a thing we're talking about. If he was watching this, he would have no clue what either of us have said. No idea. Yeah, absolutely none.
Yeah, and I
You know?
didn't do this episode, as like a recipe for the Democrats or something. It was more speaking to this societal thing, and I think, but it's also the recipe is more about men in general because the place men are going from moving to the right in many cases is detrimental to the men themselves, right? Particularly if they do fall into kind of the manosphere and the radicalization and all that, and that's probably a subset, but men are unhappy, right? I mean,
Yes.
in many ways. So it's not necessarily a recipe to fix Democrats. And I know that's more what you're looking for as someone on the left trying to promote that. But I know with my show, that's not exactly what I'm promoting. I'm promoting more like these men are struggling. Like let's switch more towards the pain side than the cause of the pain side. Like they're the victim of the pain side, and we need to. I think go under like if it's not Schumer, it's just not. It's somebody has
Right.
to go listen and understand what's happening, and then figure out how are we going to speak to these men.
Well, I think one of the nice things about the episode, as much as I'm kind of making it about politics, that's kind of my thing. Um, as much as I think one of the great things about it is it was very non-political. I think you did focus on it from a our society is starting to not function because of this angle, which I think is very important. I certainly wrote about that a lot when I was writing at the Good Men Project. Um, and I was writing about sacred archetypes and very not political things about men, manhood, and masculinity. Um, and I think that is an important angle, and I think it's something it makes the issue accessible to both sides, and I think that's very important to understand we have a bit of a crisis. And one of the things I get frustrated by, and your episode did not do, and it's a compliment to you, is that you did not have someone who immediately started their little spiel that, and which I know you had all pre-recorded because I've done one of those for you. Someone did not start their pre-tape for you with but we really have to talk about women and girls. I'm like, thank God David did not put any of those in this show or did not contact them to do this show because oftentimes in a lot of these spaces, when you start to bring up these things, someone will immediately turn around and say, well, we have to focus on women and girls. I'm like, of course, always. There's lots of good things, but we've also done that for 50 years, and now we have this other crisis. We don't have to diminish our work on women and girls, which is very important, to also be addressing the issues with young men, which are societal, cultural, economic, and in some cases political, especially when they're going around shooting people in Utah. Um, that and oftentimes that's a very hard conversation to start. And so I think the one thing you got right is you found a group of commentators who actually addressed the issue rather than just going on for 10 minutes with you about why we really need to focus on women and girls. And men aren't really that important, sort of thing. So good for you for having the real conversation and not immediately having it pivot back to women and girls, sort of thing. So good for you. Good on that.
Yeah, I mean, and you could hear that when that was even a complaint. I wouldn't say a complaint quite, but something that some of the guests highlighted as well, right? That we've gone too far to create these women only spaces. Maybe there is room for men only spaces. Like it's not always the golf resort kind of thing. It's these other kind of
Yeah.
spaces men can participate in. And also Angela Denker talked about, that um, again, it's like it's not all successful, as she noted. It's not always right, but we have tried to create, um, sort of uh, broaden the guardrails for what is feminine for women, right? And we kind of
Right.
haven't done that for men, and we don't have those role models necessarily.
Yeah, and I think the reality, and I've said this sort of quietly for a while, so I guess now I'll say it out loud, is if you want to expand the definition of masculinity for men, which I'm very much in support of, as someone who has made up my own masculinity, I carry a Michael Kors handbag. So, sort of thing. Um, and when I was younger, I wore all sorts of outrageous clothes and all sorts of crazy things. Um, and if you want to expand that definition and bring that out a little bit more, then you really have to honestly, women hold that power in terms of you have to not immediately decide you're never going to sleep with a dude because he does something that's a little bit unusual or not traditionally masculine. Women hold the keys on that. They make that decision. So you've got to this is what women, how can you help expand your own internal definition of what masculinity means to you, and don't immediately denigrate or criticize somebody who doesn't follow the old fashioned rules. Because, and I've watched this happen in my own life, and so I know it must be worse for others, is that when you're a little non-traditional or do things a little bit differently or dress a different way or whatever have you, there is certain women who immediately mark you off the list to get laid. And let's face it, for men, besides eating and breathing, that's the next most important thing in their life. As long as that's the case, men are going to stay in the man box because that's where the let's see at, like that. So if we want to expand the definitions, then we also, that's a change in narrative that needs to happen in a lot of ways to allow that to open up and happen. And for all the big deal we've made about, oh, don't live in the man box and non-traditional masculine, all this type of thing, that hasn't penetrated very far in society for the simple reason, and I think it's fair to be honest about it, most women don't want a non-traditional guy. They want a man the way our society is kinda always conceived of that. And so, as long as that's the case, men will go where the women are at. So,
Well, I think one area that
which
was
is why
touched.
queer spaces can be so much fun because that's not happening there.
Right. Uh, so I think one area that was kind of brought out as a piece of part of this crisis is, the expression of emotion, right? I mean, I think there's sort of this
Mhm.
traditionally there aren't that many ways for men to express emotion that were sort of accepted in society, right? I mean, men aren't allowed to cry and or at least feel that way, or they're not allowed to talk about their issues. They always, as you say, have to sort of defer to everybody else before, especially white men sometimes feel that way. Got to defer to
Yes.
everybody else before they can talk about their challenges. Because, oh, well, here we go again, another white guy who's so privileged now complaining about something. Like, who wants to listen to
Yes.
that, right? So,
Right.
and so that's another piece of these role models in ways that can um, show that there's other males that are demonstrating masculinity without the only kind of expression of emotion as being anger and violence.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, a lot of us, that's really tough. My dad is ex-military. He was in the Navy for 9 years. I have never seen him cry once in, 3 decades sort of thing. Um, and I happen to have a very, my mother's kind of that way too. um, my dad is very good at, he was never a terribly emotional guy. And most young men who, especially if you knew your father sort of thing, probably had that experience because if you're my age, your fathers were boomers or first cohort Gen X. And that was, and double dose for like your father who was silent or greatest generation, I would imagine, sort of thing. So and they an emotion, the greatest generation didn't know what an emotion was, much less how to have one. So I mean, so there's a long tradition of that in this country. We don't have a lot to draw on, and and I think there was sort of a little bit of a movement in that direction. I think that has opened up somewhat. There's been a little bit of opening on that. More and more guys, particularly I see it in addiction spaces, particularly I see it in some other spaces where that has started to open up a little bit. You have sports stars, which is a great way for that to start, openly talking about being in therapy, having, dealing with emotions other than all this type of thing. And that's an excellent way to start that conversation. And that conversation is not only happening in this country, it's also happening in other countries in Europe where footballers are talking about some of this stuff, all this type of thing. I think there's been an opening there, but we have a long way to go. And I think honestly, it's going to take another couple generations to really move that forward. I think one of the great things about people my age is millennials are having kids in some volume now, and millennials are tending to parent their kids a bit differently. We found out that millennial fathers are spending more time with their children today than their grandmothers did with their parents. That's a big change. Um, Stay-at-home fathers are starting to become a thing. It's not a huge number, but there are some couples that are making a simple economic decision. She can make more money, dad stays home. And 25 years ago, there was stigma to that. Today, it's very normalized. It's starting to become normalized. It's starting to become a thing that people accept, like, oh, yeah, some couples do that sort of thing. So there's little peeks through the slats of wood where that's happening. And I think that's also getting that emotional conversation going. I think it's going to take some time, but I think it will be having a very different conversation about this in 20 years um, than we are having today because millennials are making it different for their children. I think Gen Z men will make it different for their children, and that will start to change it, but it will take time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so let's talk about a couple things. One, let's talk about your book a little bit. So, this is called
Yeah.
America's Lost Generation, right? And it's focused
Yes.
on millennials, but it also have discussion about Gen Z, right?
So I started writing it during the pandemic in 2020, and I realized that Gen Z was really coming out, and I should probably slip in some stuff about them. So very late in the writing process, I went back to the whole book and started slip jamming some Gen Z stuff in places and whatnot. But the main focus of the book is it's the story of millennials post Great Financial Crisis and sort of the ways in which if the world hadn't changed, we had on our hands in 2008 the largest, most educated generation in American history. Millennials took a laundry list of requirements from their boomer parents, and we decided, yeah, we're going to tick every box. As someone crassly put it, millennials made a terrible mistake. They tried to win. They tried to use the system to win, and that was probably never going to happen. Um, and then the world changed and kind of put everything sort of off the rails for a lot of people. And so I discussed the economic angle, I discussed the entitlement programs that we'll have to pay for, but I also get into other stuff like online dating and how that has completely broken the dating market for most people.
I
Women
think it's
get
broken our
unsolicited.
brains.
It has. And I told you, I said, guys can't get a date, women get unsolicited dick pics. This is a complete disaster for all parties involved. Um, and also the economic changes of women have hit their economic stride. The economic calculus between men and women is very different than it was even 30 years ago. That has also changed the social dynamics. So I even get into kind of those outer reach issues as well. And then I kind of bring it all together and realize that your experience as a millennial depended a great deal on what class you started out with. And there's kind of multiple stories. There's a story of failed upward mobility from the middle class. We have middle class by many. There's a story of failed downward mobility, which I know very well because I'm the idiot who chose to be a full-time artist. Downward
Yeah.
mobility for some of the rest of us, sort of thing, and also the sort of the lack of social mobility. I have an article coming out called "Millennials and the Social Mobility Engine That Couldn't." The lack of social mobility for so many people in what I call the long depression. One of my arguments for a long time has been the 2008 recession never actually ended. It kept going. And the reason why things have been so difficult economically is that we've been stuck in this sort of economic malaise for all of the 2010s and now most of the 2020s. But yes, I get into all of those issues. But the real the real point of the book is that I wanted to, a lot has been written about millennials. A lot of very negative things have been written about millennials. What I wanted to do is I wanted to tell the story of what really happened and why. So the book doesn't just feature data and numbers and all this type of thing. It also features real life interviews from the Lost Generation subreddit. And it also shows how a similar story happened in Japan in the 90s and what future that offers for us. And one of the, I think, shocking things that I figured out is for all that's been said, for all that's been done, for all the issues that have happened in Japan, for all the people that got left behind due to their property crisis in 1991, the affected population who never got a good enough job to pay into the Japanese pension system was 900,000. If we times that by three to American population of 300 million, that means there's probably about 2.7 million people in this country who genuinely got left behind by the recession and who will probably likely never recover. And the unfortunate reality is that's just not a large enough number to really move public policy in any meaningful way. And so this is a story of an unlikely group of people who lost out on a lot due to a series of economic changes they had no control over, and how wealth inequality has gotten a lot worse. But the reality is a lot of millennials are doing okay. Home ownership rate is at 54%, which is lower than their parents, but it's over half. Household wealth is still abysmal. The wealth inequality angle is kind of unchanged. Household wealth is abysmal. Millennials hold 4% of national wealth, and 2% of that's Mark Zuckerberg. Um, so literally just Mark Zuckerberg. So there's still some things that have affected all millennials, but what I went through, what I saw my friends go through, what I saw other people went through was really something that was relatively small in comparison. So I started writing a book about what I thought was affecting everyone, only to discover where you started socioeconomic wise very much affected what your millennial experience was. And I remember at one of my first interviews, I talked to someone and he was kind of like, "Well, yeah, I see a lot of guys spending and spending a lot of money on a lot of dumb stuff, and they need to kind of get it together financially and all this type of thing." And I'm kind of like, "Okay, the people I'm talking about don't have the money to spend on dumb stuff. This is not the person I should be talking to. I'm telling a different story." But I circled back to that interview. I'm so glad I did it because initially I was kind of like, "Oh, this is all wrong. That's not what I'm doing." But towards the end, I circled back to it and I'm like, "Oh, this is a conversation of class, which is a conversation we struggle to have in this country. This is a conversation of class." And the reality is, I really wrote a story about how the social mobility engine died for working class and lower middle class millennials. And those of us that started up a bit higher ended up having profound downward mobility that we were not prepared to deal with. And those fluid economic dynamics are really what affected millennials. So, all that's in the book. It's all there. It's this fascinating story. It includes data, it includes real interviews, and it is a comprehensive look at, millennials in the 21st century. So you're muted, David.
Sorry, every time I read something from you, my charging up because my battery's almost dead, so I'm gonna cut off this soon.
Oh,
But,
yeah.
every time I read something here, there's always some like, your research is really powerful because there's always some new research I didn't know about, something like that, right? So I know that this book is probably in that same vein where there'll be a lot of new data I haven't seen before, so and collected in ways that make sense.
Yes, I mean, I relied heavily on Theft of a Decade. I relied heavily on a couple books about Japan. I went and really pulled reportage about millennials, not just in America, but in Canada. I pull housing data, social security data. So there's a lot of that stuff in there. There's a lot of stuff about, needs, not in employment, education, or training, how they compare to hikikomori. And that's where the Gen Z conversation really enters in. And how the type of economic stagnation that we've lived through has created this situation where for a lot of young people, it's just not worth it to them to do much with their lives. And so they kind of get stuck in economic purgatory, which also for young men is not going to get you laid. So these problems all start to tie together and weave into each other and interact in all sorts of fun ways. If I were a visual person, I would do some really cool chart that shows how it all connects and how my brain sort of sees all these clusters of issues. But yeah, it's it is very fascinating. It's going to include a lot of that stuff. So I would invite everyone to pick up a copy. If you want to be really supportive, you can go to CameronJournal.com and click on Shop Cameron's Books. It's still on sale for 14.95 right now. Or if you want to be less supportive but still want to read, Amazon.com. Like I get paid more if
Yeah.
you buy it from me, but also Amazon.com.
Well, and also, yeah, you can support someone who's actually doing the work. And even if it may even be possible to get the book, have your local bookseller find the book for you and get it too. So,
Yes, it is. I'm distributed through Ingram, world's largest English-speaking bookseller. So if you go into any local bookstore, you can have them order it. So and also it's online for Walmart, Target, Barnes and Noble. So if you walk into a Barnes and Noble and ask for it, they will order it for you. Same thing with any local bookstore that uses Ingram. Absolutely, you can.
so
So
yeah, let's do a separate follow up interview just about the book.
yeah,
Uh, and yeah, we'll do that. I'm I I want to. I know I said I said before that the episode that I did wasn't a recipe for Democrats to sort of fix this problem, but that's
yeah.
an area where you're sort of interested. So if you could give Democrats a recipe, what would you tell them to sort of change the narrative for young men?
I would say you need to completely shift the narrative. Um, I know that we're the party that has decentered men to the favor of centering all their minority groups. That probably was a mistake, and we probably need to roll that back, and we need to embrace men in the positive, wonderful way that it can be, but to embrace men, particularly white men. And I think that also means when you're working on social issues, not attacking white men. But if we're going to be serious about diversity, equity, and inclusion, if that's going to be our thing, then that also means that we need to include men, particularly white men. We need to listen to those issues and problems, take them seriously, and come up with strong liberal policy that's going to move that forward. And that also means not entertaining narratives from certain fringe parts of the party that just want to complain about these groups, to complain about these things. That also may mean that we are going to have to, not necessarily roll back support, but perhaps have some narrative shift regarding trans issues, especially, or around abortion, different of these issues, to understand you have to have these conversations. You have to have that talk. Those people vote too. And even when it comes to things like public safety, you know, I've always long said one of the biggest liabilities of the Democratic Party is that blue cities have a lot of policy issues and a lot of problems. Oh, if we want to show this country how the Democratic Party can govern, every major city in this country should be a paradise to live in. And with Donald Trump's whole send the National Guard in thing, he's really trying to enforce that narrative the Democrats cannot govern, sort of thing. So I think it's very vital that we start making some good governance policies on that, and we start listening and embracing to men of all colors, and find and really opening up to white men. I think there's an opportunity to get this back in line, but it's going to take more than just a magic candidate at the top of the ticket. It's going to take more than some video or whatever have you. It's going to have to be a complete narrative and attitude shift. Based upon what happened with David Hogg, I don't think the party is even ready to have that conversation yet. But that's what it's going to take, really and
Right.
truly. Yeah.
That's kind of what I was thinking when you were talking. Is like this is a big risk for
Yes.
for anybody to start to talk this way, right? Because yeah, it's counter to they're risking that the ostracizing that we talked about, like that we're risking the whole meme of the show to some degree, which is like this the unforgiving nature of the left.
Yes, well, Obama called it the circular firing squad, which I thought was the most apt way of putting it. You can rely on Barack Obama to say talk about something properly. Um, and yes, and but it requires a whole narrative shift, a whole attitude shift, and also most importantly, understanding that men have issues, and we as a party, as a political philosophy, need to take them seriously because right now the right owns that space. We shouldn't let them at all. But that also means that we need to start talking about that and having real conversations. And that means commentators have to start going in that direction. That means, a lot of people have to start making that shift. And that means we need to give up on things that we've gotten used to. Language policing, thought policing, all this type of thing. All that stuff has to go overboard. That's was a huge turnoff to young men. Just because someone uses a word does not necessarily mean they're a bad person. Their actions will bear that out for you. Give them time. That won't take very long. But to all that sort of language policing, thought policing sort of thing, that stuff has really got to go. I was never a fan of it to start with, so I'm not sad to see it go. But there were some people that were very passionate about that. I think it achieves some goals in getting people to think about others outside themselves, being maybe a little bit more careful with their language. But I think at this point, it's gone so extreme, we now come off as the HR department.
Yeah.
And nobody, nobody likes HR. HR doesn't even like themselves. No one likes HR. So I think it's a huge narrative and attitude shift. Ironically, I think Tim Waltz, before they hired the consultants, was on the way to that. Um, I think perhaps that is a taste of what things could look like going forward. I think Gavin Newsom has certainly figured out how to get some online buzz going. Um, but yeah, we got to stop being beholden to so many fringe parts of the party and get back to a place where mainstream Democrats can be happy and proud to be Democrats again. And that means opening up to men. And that was, I think, the thing part that gives me hope is in your episode, I really felt like there are some people who are ready for that conversation. And some of the people you were talking to are leading that conversation. And that gives me hope that in time we can start to begin that narrative shift. But nothing happens fast down at the DNC.
Yeah. Well, and and something else, I mentioned in the episode this. I think it's a persistent thing that just it's just hard to get people out of people's head. Is this idea of this automatically this kind of emerging Democratic majority theory, right? That's been since
Right.
the early 2000s, and it's sort of been proven not to be true since then. But people
Yeah,
still kind of believe it, like it'll just magically happen. We'll just wait, all these boomers will die, and suddenly everyone will be a Democrat. Nope.
no, not even close. And I was talking with someone who is to my left the other night, and he keeps talk. I mean, he used the phrase "silent majority" more than Nixon did in '72. I mean, it was. I mean, but he's at. It's a word. I'm like, you're starting to sound like a MAGA person. Horseshoe theory is unbeaten. Like, it's like I think the uncomfortable thing for both parties and I think Republicans struggle with it less than Democrats, is every election you have to make the case for your vision of the country. The Democrats are hoping for a permanent majority that will give them, the mandate of heaven and 1,000-year liberal Reich. The Republicans are trying to change all the election voting laws to make sure Democrats structurally can't win anymore. Unfortunately, only one of those things will be successful, and it's not the one I want. So that's sad. But but I mean, the reality is, every single election, you have to make your case for voters. The Democrats are on the unfortunate position that when our fringe speaks, it automatically becomes part of our identity. The Republicans have no such problem. And there's some genuinely crazy shit said on the far right. I mean, really deranged Christian nationalist, white supremacist. It never becomes part of the GOP brand for the simple reason, this gets into my branding and marketing expertise. The simple reason the Republican Party constantly is defining itself in the marketplace. It's constantly telling you who they are. The Democratic Party has never owned their identity or narrative in my lifetime. Ever? No, never. Not once. The Democratic Party and liberals are always defined by the Republican Party. Margaret Thatcher said her greatest achievement in British politics was the election of Tony Blair because she had broken the back of the Labour Party and had turned them into the Tory light party. And that because they had so shifted and changed the narrative that old Labour could not win elections, and they figured out the only way they could win was to be milquetoast conservatives. Something very similar happened in this country around the same time. We just got it 5 years earlier than the British because of elections in 1982 with Bill Clinton. But the reality is the Republican Party and the Conservatives in the UK figured out how to define the narrative, define themselves, and most importantly, define the party opposite. Which means basically they're constantly in control of the narrative. The Democratic Party has to learn how to define itself in the marketplace, which is crazy. We're the party of the creatives, the artists, movie stars, Hollywood, blah blah blah. We can't brand or market ourselves to save our political lives.
So
And the GOP does it so much better, and they're oil people and troglodytes. Like it's
well, it's interesting because, well, and there's also a big, well, there's so much we can go on there, but like I had talked to a friend recently who's I've known forever, like, really good at marketing. Like I'm not, that's not my thing necessarily, but I
you
do
know,
respect the people that are good at it. And she's really good at it. And she had a great line to me is like, organizations are where simple ideas go to die, right? And that's what
amen.
the Democrats need to me is something like that, a simpler idea, right? They need their own version of make America great kind of thing. And like you
You
said,
know,
define themselves and, in a way that regular people can understand. Cause it's always all we wonky and all this kind of stuff, right?
yes. I saw someone was replying to an old Kamala Harris tweet from the campaign. And I was kind of like, I saw it this morning and I said, if this isn't representative of the problem, her tweet uses too many long SAT words. It's very loquacious, very highbrow. I'm sure someone spent a lot of time writing it. And I know some of those people who do that sort of thing at the Democratic Party. And the replies to it all did not use a word over 2 syllables and were much shorter. And a lot of vulgar language I will not use right now was used. And I'm kind of like, that's the problem. The Democrats not just it is a messaging problem, but it's also an attitude problem. And this is the problem when you become the party of the educated and urban elite. This is kind of what killed the McGovern campaign in '72. Is you or even Adlai Stevenson in '56. You when you have those people in control and their issues dominating the party, sort of thing, that whole conversation dies at about Ohio, if it even makes it a Pennsylvania sort of thing. And it doesn't go any farther than about 150 miles inland on the West Coast either. And that's it. And unfortunately, because of our election system, that's not going to get you a House majority. It's not going to get you Senate seats, and it sure as hell not going to get you the White House. So, you really have to, learn how to talk about other issues in the middle of the country. And if I were the DNC, I would start talking to a lot of the amazing people in the South. Talk about tough Democrats in a tough position, but who still advocate, still win offices, still are out there having those conversations. Like hire some organizers from Mississippi or something. They know how to exist in a deep red state and still get stuff done. That's who needs to be in charge of messaging and all this type of thing, not the Ivy League consultants they tend to hire. Get people from different economic backgrounds. Find someone who grew up on a farm in Iowa. Get out of Harvard and Yale and all that stuff. Get away from that whole attitude and start talking to people out in the country. That is where the future of the party is at. And you can you can get North Carolina back. Obama won it twice not that long ago. You can get Ohio back. You can get some of these places back. But the Democratic Party is not even fighting these battles anymore. There are races where no one is even being run. Sometimes important House races where the party's just given up because they're not even trying. And it's kind of like we can't constantly blame the far left or the moderates or independents or even the GOP when you're not even trying,
Yeah.
you know. And that's, that is, a difficult thing. It's a total mindset shift. And like I said, based on what they did to David Hogg, that tells me that the National Party is not ready for that shift yet. And
Right.
being like, check a calendar. We have a very finite time to do this. And if you want to prevent more authoritarianism, more fascism, all this type of thing, then we have to fight like hell. Run a Democrat in every single seat from dog catcher. I mean, everything, everything, and be very open. And don't police people's language. If someone uses a light slur sort of thing, let it go. Now is not the time for that sort of thing. We tried that, didn't work. Time to move on. Little things like that. That's how you get voters back.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Well, Cameron, so I'll say that the episode that we were talking about came out 10 days ago, something like that, 2 Wednesdays ago. It's called, I think it's called, I don't even remember the name of my episodes all the time, but it's something like Why Young Men Are Being Pulled to the Right, something like that. Just a discussion
Yes.
about the gender gap among Gen Z, and sort of the history of that, as well as some others. And Cameron says about a 34-minute episode, and it's a documentary style with several participants. And
And
Cameron
it's so
Cohen
good.
has, yeah, oh, thank you. And Cameron Cohen has a book I haven't read yet, but I'm definitely going to check it out, America's Lost Generation. So I will read that, and then we will have a conversation about it.
Yep. No, thank you so much, David, for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining and helping out.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye bye.